Today's going to be a short lecture on income, welfare, and education policy. Um, Something that often isn't the most exciting topic to deal with, but it's important nonetheless. Let's start off by explaining kind of how the United States got to where it is today, because we're specifically talking about the United States, although in context it could be seen from pretty much anywhere. And so let's talk about the after World War II. After World War II, or at least up until World War II, there was a sense of, you know, the way you existed in life was to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Um, so basically, using whatever the tools were available to you, you would use those in order to, make your life a better life. And for the most part, that worked as a really good kind of a background way of dealing with things, but when it came to certain things, it didn't, because I mean, a lot of people were being ignored to begin with and weren't being paid attention to at all. The rich was always going to be rich. The rich people were always going to be rich people, and the poor were never going to have anything. So the what but what happened in the around the 1940s going into the 1950s is after World War II ended, the United States was pretty much the only, surviving industrial country that, didn't have to rebuild itself from scratch. I mean, all of Europe was practically in shambles. And then, I mean, we spent a lot of our economic clout kind of helping them get back up to where they were so they could, be good trading partners in the future, including even the nations that were our enemies at that time, so the Axis powers and all that. So the idea of this particular period in time is things were looking really, really good for the United States. And so the idea of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps works a lot easier if there's a whole lot of resources available for you. And the United States exists under a manifest destiny, you know, form the land or take the land and pretty much do everything you want with it because there's always going to be more. Well, I mean, obviously it was going to run out. Um, there's only a certain amount of space, and once people start filling it up, you really don't have the resources you would have had before. So what ends up happening around the 1950s is this whole, pulling yourself up from your bootstraps thing works really well and grows into another idea of this American exceptionalism. So the idea is that not only is America a great place because it's the one that defeated all of the Axis powers during the war, and became the most powerful country in the world for a very long time, and arguably could still be considered that today, although it's kind of fallen a lot, which has all sorts of other things involved, which have nothing to do with this particular situation. But let's talk about economics. So economics, we ended up getting more and more resources available to us, and those resources benefited a lot of people. So during this period, up until about the 1960s and 1970s, more and more, people who never really had, a whole lot of economic clout before were now getting a lot more. So people could buy cars, and those cars that they bought would fuel an industry that would cause more and more people to work. And so, people got to work. It was no longer, I mean, remember, we came from a depression in the 1920s. And so the depression's over, the war is over, and now everything's starting to build and things are starting to look pretty good. Well, this goes pretty well until about the 1970s. And then in the 1970s, something a little different starts happening. A lot of political processes were put into place, a lot of economic political processes were put into place to try to get more of those great resources back to the people who felt that they deserved it because they were the ones earning all of the money. And so what you ended up having was a situation where the rich got much richer. So, I mean, if you look at some of the distributions that they've done on this, the the wealth of the rich, the higher upper, you know, top 5, 10%, was astronomically growing. Whereas the people who were actually on the bottom part of that scale, well, even before we talk about them, so the people about the middle of it, there was growth, but their growth was really lessened. And it got to a point where right about the 1980s or so, you start to see the curve start going back down. So the only reason it ever goes up, and this is why people who want to argue that everything's great and there's nothing to worry about, they like to argue that, well, the number shows it just keeps going up on the scale. Well, not really, because when you start figuring inflation and all sorts of other compensation mechanisms to it, you start to realize that the amount of money that people have to live on as opposed to the amount of money they actually get is not, there's no correlation. As a matter of fact, they don't match each other at all. So it's costing more money for people with less money to survive, even if their income actually went up. And the problem, I was mentioning the bottom part of that list. And so the bottom part of it, so when you're talking, you know, the lower 20% of America, that lower 20% actually lost money. So, I mean, instead of going up, you know, where their income distribution and their income levels that were coming in, they actually started going down. So, like I said, inflation went up, so stuff still costs more money, and the rich were getting richer as they went along and basically had fewer things to worry about, whereas the poor got even poorer. And so what ends up happening is you have a lot of people starting to have to rely more on government than anywhere else because they have no resources to fall back on. And for a part of the problem with that is when you have this kind of dichotomy going on in the country, is the people who have the biggest voices are the people with the most power and economic, you know, freedom to do whatever they want to do. They don't have to sit around trying to figure out how to, you know, put food on the table. They're spending larger amounts of time, you know, enjoying life and actually taking advantage of the political system to get the things they want so they can get more resources for themselves and kind of figure everything's fine. So what we end up having is this mindset that kind of grows in America where the rich are convinced that the poor basically don't want to work when they do. Quite often they can't even get jobs. And so, or the jobs that they get don't pay hardly anything. But the rich keep getting more and more money and more access to everything and seem to think there's no problem. And you have a kind of a dissociation of mind thought. And so part of me always worries about the, you know, the Marie Antoinette, you know, connection, you know, such as if you ignore the poor for so long, it could really come back and stab you badly. So, but one of the problems for the poor themselves is they generally don't have an ability to, you know, coordinate and get something done. I mean, in the 1960s, there was a poor people's movement, and a whole bunch of people got together and marched on Washington and tried to, you know, enact change. So they got there, and you know, members of Congress were kind of worried because, you know, there's a whole bunch of people in Washington now, you know, a lot of people, poor people, and they're not leaving. So what they ended up doing was making all sorts of demands. They got one small little demand met, not at that particular time, but promised that it would be given to them. And then basically they, you know, dispersed and went their own way. And then soon after that happened, government, realizing they didn't have to actually do anything because they're not there protesting anymore, basically didn't do it. And so you end up with that kind of a problem. And then the next time, the next year that they were going to do another Poor People's Movement, another march, they all got together. They tried to get them together again, but very few people showed up because we have what's Anthony Downs's free rider problem, which is if people tend to get their benefits from a movement in a previous one, they sometimes don't participate in the second one, thinking, well, there were so many people there last time, they're not going to miss me. And so what happens was they were missed because very few people showed up and, served the purpose that they actually wanted to do. So the question is often asked, how fair is the system itself? And so there's this belief that there's this equality of opportunity, meaning that we all start from the same ground level, and then we work our way up based on how much work we intend to put into the picture. Part of the problem with that is the results are sometimes skewed and sometimes have a lot to do with basically who you are, where you live, what your resources were available to take advantage to make something like that happen. Again, a good example is like a very rich person who will then turn around and say, look, I brought myself up on my bootstraps, and I got all the way up on myself, and I didn't have anybody helping me. Well, sometimes they did. They had a lot of people helping them. There are many multi-millionaires who got their fortune after inheriting their parents' millionaire fortune. So, I mean, but they don't see that as having to have worked for that. Somehow they earned it, even though, they were given, something to start with. Whereas other people with no resources whatsoever, living in a place of destitution, realizes they have no options to do anything, and so they're just barely going to survive, and yet they're seen under the same standards of not making it like somebody else did, even though that other person had so much available. So it's kind of something to think about. And, I'm not advocating that it's you have to do anything about it, but be aware of it in the background because it does exist. One of the solutions to this has often been, and it's not an incorrect solution if it works, is education. And if taken advantage of, education can be a very strong vehicle to get one out of poverty and destitution. Problem with it is not always do you have the best access to it. We really stifle a lot of our young people when they go to school in the very beginning because they go into neighborhoods where there's not a whole lot of educational resources available to them. The teachers aren't that great because teachers don't want to work in a scary neighborhood, if that's kind of like what it ends up being, or a scary school because they're not even sure about their safety. So I mean, the more and more problems and frailties that you have built into the system that make it difficult for somebody to achieve what they want to achieve, well, that's a problem. And so one of the things with the civil rights movement and the affirmative action plans and all that was to try to bring all the levels up, so at least all boats could float at the same time. Part of the problem with that is sometimes resources are not available and you end up getting what you can. And so what will end up happening is a lot of times the focus will be on that one student that did really, really well in horrible circumstances. And then the expectation is that, well, everyone should be able to do that. And that doesn't always work so well because it could even be something as simple as one person's motivation or one person rubbing off on them at the right time to all sorts of different reasons as to why someone succeeds and someone doesn't. Yet there's a belief that if you didn't make it, then, well, it's your problem. And that's one of the problems we run into with this country is you can't really rely on that, because if you do and you have more and more destitution in your country, you're going to have serious problems in the future. It hits a point, and once it does, it doesn't come back. And so anyway, just one of those side little warnings that countries sometimes often forget about, and the people who should be focusing on it are basically the ones in government, the politicians, and people in power. But some people tend to like being in power and having what they want, and because they got there, they figure they don't have to do anything further about other things because it's basically not on their radar, and that's what causes all sorts of problems. So let's talk about one of the solutions that's kind of helped, especially for education, because one of the things in this country is we have more and more people who have never had access to college before, previous generations that now do, and some people who have graduated that never would have had a chance before. And so families that basically that should have just been farmers because that's all they really have done, through generation to generation, they're now going into colleges and they're actually becoming productive members of society by, kind of giving back by the education that they received, which gives them all sorts of opportunities and gives them kind of a much higher ability to think things through, because economic clout often quite comes from education, and sometimes, it's not sometimes, always, the two are linked together. And it's the higher your education, the more likely you are to be somebody who ends up in a better financial situation. At least you'll have the resources, or at least the knowledge to find the resources, which kind of tends to help things out there. And basically, as I said before, on boats, it lifts all boats. I mean, the whole, the water just rises and makes everyone in a better place. So, but one of the ways of solving this, that's what I'm starting to get into, is they decided to help people pay off their college by actually giving them student loans. And before this, we had the GI Bill, which was happens after the war, which is to help people who served the country to actually go back to school, or to go to school if they never even went in the first place, and get a degree, and then use those degrees in order to better the country going forward. There's also plans put in place to, like the GI loan, which is to give money to former soldiers to actually get them to buy housing. So now you've got more ownership of land, which when you have more ownership of land, it basically provides a stronger bond to the country itself, because people have an investment in it and think, wow, this is my country, I have something here, as opposed to I'm just renting and really only sticking around for a little while. It's kind of a weird way of looking at it, but you get what I mean. So the problem you kind of run into with at that time, prices kept going higher, and then states couldn't afford to keep funding a lot of the students that were going to school, because the federal government was cutting back on money on that. And there's always been this attempt to save money, for the amount that you're putting into the system. So a very strong conservative ideal for the longest time has been, why should we pay so much money? I only want to get, the results that I want to see. And so you end up with fewer and fewer programs being funded, so less social services, and then there's less money for education. So basically they put the cost on the students themselves, thinking, well, they want the education, and then they do what they have to do. What they kind of forget is not just is the education benefiting them, but it's educating the country. And we sometimes forget that. And when we forget that, we kind of let these things fall apart. And so what's happened with student loans is we basically left students to kind of fend for themselves because the interest has gotten so high that, or not just the interest so high, but the loans keep racking up and it became more and more expensive to go to school. So somebody who went to school back in the 1960s managed to pay their way through it with a part-time job. And so that same person is now one of the leaders of industry today. Those types of people, I'm not saying one specific person, and they look back on what they went through and say, well, anybody can do what I did. It was really easy, but the circumstances have changed, and they refuse to look at that and just ignore it because it's easier to do. And so the idea is, okay, well, we can give them less money because that money is more important for us doing what we do, to get their infrastructure taken care of and their taxes low and all that sort of stuff. So what's ended up happening is the student loan situation has turned into a student loan crisis. And so people can't pay their loans back. People are defaulting, but you can't default because the agencies that run the student loan programs basically have a situation where they don't even have to give a way out. And even the few ways out beyond just completely paying it off, people have a really, really hard time accessing those because they're so mired in bureaucratic red tape that sometimes it's difficult to even get those done. So that's kind of the idea of where we are today with our economic situation in the United States. We're not in a hopeless situation, but we're ending up in a situation where students are borrowing more money. There's not a whole lot of money going into like helping people out as much as they used to do before, because there's always this mindset that falls back in the United States of, going your own way, doing your own thing. As long as that's part of the ideal in the United States, it's going to be a serious problem. Because if you look at other countries, they don't really have this problem, and there's more of a social aspect to dealing with the population, such as, I don't mean socialism, but I mean, an idea of looking at your fellow citizens and trying to help them and lift them up rather than saying, this is where you need to get, now try to get there. And so hopefully we kind of move that around, but just letting you know how it exists, and that's kind of where we are today.